Morning all, I'd like to show you another excellent memorable game of Robert James Fischer from the Bled Zagreb Belgrade Candidates Tournament of 1959. This was played in 3 different cities of the former Yugoslavia. So against Vasily Smyslov, Fischer was playing black, and this is in round 28 of this grueling event. Each player plays the other competitors 4 times in this tournament, and in round 21 Fischer had played white against Smyslov's Sicilian defence and suffered a defeat. So could he get revenge in this round against the great Vasily Smyslov? The year of this game, 1959, is not long after Smyslov was World Chess Champion. He was champion from 1957 to 58 in fact. Smyslov was also a candidate for the World Championship on 8 occasions: 1948, 50, 53, 56, 59, 65, 83 and 85. He twice tied for first at the Soviet Championship, 1949 and 55, and he had 17 Chess Olympiad medals in total, which is an all-time record. In 5 European Team Championships, Smyslov won 10 gold medals. So okay, Smyslov kicks off with e4 in this game, and Fischer sticks with his knight off. Knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, and the characteristic knight off move a6 is played. And we see bishop g5, e6, and this very sharp move f4. Now in this position, Fischer could go for what's known as the poison pawn variation, but in this tournament he was playing alternatives, and this is the major alternative, which he was playing bishop e7. And in fact, according to my live book, bishop e7 is slightly less risky than queen b6. So bishop e7, and now we see queen f3, and now we see queen c7 from Fischer. So this is a very familiar setup. White castles queenside. Now Fischer plays knight bd7, and here, instead of bishop e2, which had occurred in another Fischer game in this tournament against Keres, so instead of bishop e2 we see the sharp g4. There's options here. So g4 is a very, very sharp move. Fischer reacts with b5, so not too worried about e5. He can always respond with bishop b7. White takes on f6, and after knight takes f6 plays g5, driving this knight back. So it goes to d7. And now, in modern theory, the move played most frequently in this position is actually f5, offering a pawn sacrifice. For example, bishop takes g5. If white now enjoys that g-file pressure, so if black dares castle, this looks quite good. Not too bad for white this position. In fact, white might be slightly bit better here. So this is the kind of modern continuation to play f5 here. Not worried about the g5 pawn. Another alternative, not as popular in modern times, is a3. This prophylaxis move comes at a time cost, and in fact a3 can be used as for black to leverage open that to get leverage to wrench open the b file against b2. For example, a3, rook b8, h4, b4, a takes, rook takes, bishop h3, queen c5, hitting the knight, driving that back. We're asking a question to it, say knight b3, queen b6. This kind of position, black stands quite well, very well in fact, here. So a3 is a prophylaxis move against b4, which is a bit of a time waste in some respects as well. It's a double-edged sword to play a3. So the sharpest move known now is f5. In the game, though, we see a very rare bird move, bishop h3. Maybe this was specifically prepared against Fischer. The Russians ganging up against Fischer in this tournament. In fact, statistically, in the book My 60 Memorable Games, there are 7 games from this tournament in 1959, which is more games from a particular tournament than any other in the entire book. So Fischer meeting these USSR World Chess Champions in this tournament and seemingly trying to crack his Najdorf in various different ways. So this test, bishop h3, purposely omitting a3 for some reason. And in their round 21 game, the very same question was actually posed to Fischer against Smyslov. Should he play a3 or not? And in that game, Fischer refused to play a3 and actually sacrificed the pawn for a dangerous initiative. But as white, Fischer lost that. So Smyslov is also saying, you know, he can allow b4 as well. So what does b4 offer to black here, though? It is played after knight ce2. We see that really this knight being driven back to d7 is ideal for coming to c5 to put pressure on e4. Bishop b7 can also put pressure on e4. So lots of pressure on e4. But it's not completely crazy for this knight reroute, because from there, from g3, it supports e4 and can sometimes pounce to either h5 or f5. So this is, of course, a double-edged sword to get this knight to an aggressive position here on g3. Nevertheless, let's see. Bishop b7. For the moment, e4 doesn't need to be defended. King b1, and now knight c5. So that e4 is under fire, it's protected, but it is also potentially an attacking move. But here is an interesting move that Fischer played, which requires perhaps, you can argue, quite a lot of guts to play this move. His king still in the centre, and a lot of us have this generalisation, a fearful generalisation, that if your king's still in the centre, you shouldn't try and undertake active operations, even if they appear quite lucrative. And here it seems there's some logical steps to black's play. He's driven the knight away from e4, and he's arranging more and more pressure on e4, and this next move seems a logical flow against the e4 pawn to play d5, but the king is in the centre here. So how dangerous is this? Okay, if Fischer had castled, it does look as though, for example, this variation, if black doesn't play g6, it seems f5 is quite dangerous for f6 potentially. But you know, maybe d5 here is also possible just about. But let's not go too much into that. So the move d5 here, not castling. So what does Smyslov play? Well, here he's perhaps looking at that king in the centre and trying to punish black with just the move f5. So a very sharp game from Smyslov, smart, sharp attacking game, offering a pawn here, which is taken. And engines suggest queen e3 might be a good move in this position, keeping a blockade on that e-pawn. But with all the pieces on the board here, you'd think this e-pawn isn't a problem, that it's a sort of passed e-pawn. So queen e3, for example, still keeps the pressure on e6. So if castles, this could be quite good for white, this position for sure. And in fact, black's best might be queen e5, trying to just hold on to e6 and inviting a perpetual attack on the queen like this with knight f3. And if knight d4 again, black doesn't want to move this pawn, it's protecting f5 and the light squares, so this kind of perpetual invitation might have occurred. But in the game we see a more ambitious move with the pawn sacrifice, queen g4. Okay, so against this, what's Fischer worried? Well, actually, he takes on f5 now, inviting quite a dangerous knight. Knight d takes f5, and now he simply plays g6, ruling out the h5 and f5 squares from this knight. Just mentioned this knight routing here is quite dangerous for f5 and h5, but g6, it's weakening some dark squares, but white doesn't have the dark square bishop, so black has a kind of advantage on the dark squares in this position. Does white really want to play a move like knight h6? Knight h6, queen e5, and you can see white's dark squares are creaking like that. g5, in fact, leaving the dark square bishop on here is emphasizing black's trump card here, the dark square bishop. This knight is holding d7. There's no problem on d7 at the moment. So actually, Smyslov snaps off the dark square bishop. Queen takes e7. So with f5 and h5 secure with that g6 pawn, it doesn't look so bad here. Queen f4. Supporting moves now like rook d6. Castles, and in fact, rook d6 is played. So this offers white some possibilities, like maybe putting pressure on f6 or the continual eyeing on the d7 square. Fischer challenges the rook, and the rook goes actually to f6. And then we see rook d5, which gives the idea that actually doubling up rooks is a nice idea, or e3 at some point. So Smyslov here plays bishop g4, which not only eyes d1 but also makes way maybe for the pawn for an attack. Okay, so here we see knight d7, which is not really threatening to win material. This pawn cannot be tolerated on f6 with a mating net to follow on g7. That cannot be done. Smyslov simply reinforces that potential pawn if black dared take there. Just be getting mated. So Fischer though has this trump card which he uses. He plays e3. The passed pawn is the trump card here. In fact, let's just quickly examine knight takes e4. If that's a question, there's rook d4, nasty pin on the queen, so that's not possible. So rook f1, e3. Okay, so now black is generating some potential threats. In fact, e3, even though the passed pawn is not threatening to queen or anything, it's supporting d2 now. It's blocking the queen, eyeing d2, so rook d2, and there's a visitor on c2 all of a sudden. And that visitor on c2 could be significant. There's another rook could come as well to attack c2 at some point. We see b3, and now making use of this pawn, rook d2, knowing the queen's not eyeing d2 anymore. And now Smyslov plays bishop takes d7. After rook takes d7, he attacks this pawn, which is protected. And now this h4 move, as though maybe h5 might be dangerous at some point. Queen c5, and now it looks as though rook c8 and rook d2 are on the horizon as threats here, or even just doubling rooks for rook d1, and then queen c3. This is starting to look a little bit dangerous for white's king, and Smyslov, recognizing the situation is quite bad, plays an awful move structurally, which I think he wouldn't like to play in principle. But what else? Would he be subject to an attack? The move he plays is queen c4, inviting double pawns, and which can be immediately attacked in the game. But what else can white do here against black's threats? The principal threat, rook c8. Because if rook c1, then rook d1. Let's just demonstrate that. Say white plays h5, rook c8. Now if rook c1, this is disaster time, rook d1. And there's a threat now of queen takes c2. So this pawn has really caused havoc for white's defences here. This cannot be allowed. So this is why this has caused a panic situation now. Queen c4 seems necessary. What else is there? And also rook d2 is also dangerous. For example, queen g4, if we go with this again, rook c8, rook c1. Okay, queen g4 has the benefit of not allowing rook d1, but here rook d2 seems very dangerous for that c2 pawn. So for example, this looks good, rook takes c2, but even stronger is just to switch back to the e pawn here. Technically is even stronger, just rook e8. So white's got these problems to face simultaneously on c2 and the e pawn. So let's go back. So in the game, queen c4 is played. Fischer just snaps this off and then double attacks these pawns with rook d4. C pawn moves forward and Fischer just takes the h4 pawn. With this simplified position, it's clear that black is better, and this bishop is a very fine bishop across that diagonal. The knight's a bit helpless here. c6, bishop goes to c8, rook d8, and now if white's given time, then c7 and rook d8 are quite dangerous. So Fischer gets behind that pawn to stop any ideas like that. King b2, and now even more prophylaxis type move, and the king getting ready for other things like h6 to undermine g5, so stepping away from any potential dangers as well. King g7, we see king b3. The rook stays to support the b4 pawn here, otherwise this king could munch it, and attacks the knight. Knight e2. There's no time for c7 here because rook takes g3, rook d8 looks dangerous, but e2 check, king b2, rook ge3 just defends everything. So okay, so the knight goes back and Fischer now plays rook e6, challenging, skewing rook and pawn. The rook can't move really, it's just supported. And now the knight's attacked again. Knight f4, an exchange of rooks. Rook d2, quite brutal if taking that pawn's queening. So this rook's kind of stuck. Rook f6 is absolutely terrible. In fact, it doesn't just e2 win here, so e2 just wins there. So Smyslov is resorting to rook d3. We see rook f2, trying to get this pawn going by attacking the blockader of the pawn, the defender of e2. So rook d4, but now e2. The knight struggles now to defend the pawn with knight d3, and it's simply attacked. The rook doesn't move. Black now simply threatens to take that knight and queen. c7 is played, and here actually Fischer played rook f3. It's a winning position, technically more accurate it seems, as bishop takes d3 with no worries about white queening because black queens, and in this position check is very dangerous. If king c4, queen c2 winning the queen, if king a4 then rook takes c2 is absolutely devastating with threats of queen a2 on horizon. White's king has had it. So in the game though, Fischer chose rook f3, which is good as well. White queens, and this is a very simple endgame now simplification after bishop f5 to take on d3. This is a winning rook and pawn ending. To rook d5, rook g2. Now h6 forces these two passed pawns, the emergence of these two passed pawns. So it's really hopeless now for white once these pawns start going, which they do. Rook d6, defending against rook c6, check, holding on to the a6 pawn. Rook e6. And here Smyslov resigned. So another triumph for Fischer, setting himself up as a kind of target because he's persisting with the Najdorf in this tournament against the very strongest Russian players in the world at the time. And here he comes up triumphantly against what might have been prepared innovation, this bishop h3 move. So Fischer again, with seemingly simple logical play, gets a good advantage and holds on to it. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.